Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be continuing our discussion of themes with identical repetitions and what to do with them. In part one of this topic, we looked at the overall effects that can be achieved when we have to repeat themes. We can play them with different dynamic or atmospheric approaches, or with more temporal freedom, and in making these choices we can also take into account the structural location of the theme, and how a certain approach may influence how the audience perceives not only the repeated theme, but the material that comes after it as well. Essentially, considering the question of, our main theme repeats itself about 3 times in full, how do I play each repeat and keep them interesting to the listener? Chopin's Fourth Ballade is an interesting case because the theme itself, divorced from the rest of the piece, is built of successive repetitions. As I covered in part 1, there are 2 gestures that are repeated several times which comprise our main theme. This one, and this one. The same problem or question we faced in part 1 can apply here as well. How does one approach these gestures in their own repetitions? Let's consider some possibilities. Now, let's see what would happen if we played the complete theme without making any distinction between each repeated gesture. Another way of saying this is that we'll play the theme without doing anything to it to make it interesting. The theme itself is reasonably attractive, but there are ways that we can make it more communicative. Let's look at the theme from a structural point of view for a moment. We have this first little section, then we have this one, which is identical, but in a higher register and a different key. Then we have a little bridge section which takes us back to the original theme gesture. And then we have the final gesture which has an end. The general shape of this theme is one of a home statement, then expansion or going away from the home base, and then a return. This means that the first statement can also be the one that is least affected with vectors of interpretation. In other words, if you wanted to play this theme without affectation, you could definitely do so at the very beginning. If you play the opening theme with too much affectation, then it sabotages any future attempts to use that kind of interpretational vector, because affectation in principle is an addition to the performance of music. If you've already added to something, it becomes more difficult in future to continue adding to it. Here's what I mean. If I play this opening with too much rubato, for instance, what can I do with the theme gesture when it goes higher? If I play it with more rubato when the theme goes higher, then the theme turns into a soggy mess. If I play it with the same, then it may sound boring or predictable. And if I play it with less, then the interpretational vector goes in a contrary direction to the structure of the theme. In other words, the theme is expanding from here to here. It's expanding in range, but the affectation would be diminishing if I end up doing less rubato, as an example. It would sound quite odd. What all this means is that if a theme is constructed of repeated elements or gestures, one cannot affect a gesture too much at the beginning, so that there is space to expand or grow as the theme carries on. So, in general, your first statements can be relatively neutral. The second statement here is the expansion point, where we journey outside the familiar. Because it gives the impression of going outside, we can naturally play it with more exaggerated parameters, like doing more rubato or playing it louder. This gives the impression of a progression or journey. If I play the first statement relatively neutral, and the second one with more rubato and maybe a little louder, then we get this. We have a little bridge, which brings us back to the main theme using a fragment of the previous material. But before we consider how we can play this, let's look at the final statement. How do we end this journey? Well, we can play it with the most manipulations of sound production, articulation, dynamic, or tempo flux, because quite frankly, we can get away with it. This is not to say that this is what we should do, or what we must do, but it is a common solution. If anything, in this case, I'd say that the affectation should probably not be any less than what we used here. If we go with this build, then we have our first statement that is rather straightforward, our second statement that is more affected, and our third statement that is just as much, if not a little more. But of course, we need to consider the bridge, and this can only be considered when we know what we're coming from and where we're going. We have a strong, highly affected second statement, and a highly affected final statement that happens to be lower. The bridge here allows us to set up whatever atmosphere we want the final statement to evoke. We can transition, using this bridge, to a softer or louder dynamic, a different tone quality, and even a different tempo. Here's what I mean. Let's transition from this second statement. First, let's try to get softer and more gentle. Or, if we want the final statement to be louder and more driven, we can transition to that too. There are, of course, infinite variations and gradations in between, but this is the true power of the transitional elements, and also why transitions are amongst the most difficult parts to interpret. As I said before, we need to know where we're coming from and where we're going before we can know how to play a transition. So, let's put it all together. Our first statement can be rather straightforward, then our second statement can be a little more outgoing, and then we can use the bridge to set up a final statement that is just as outgoing as the second one. Let's try it. In short, this is the kind of decision-making process which is involved when we are determining how to play themes, especially ones that have repeated elements to them. This is not to say that my solution in this case is the only solution to the problem. This theme can be played many different ways. But there has to be thought and logic behind the construction of your theme in order for it to give the impression of sounding organic or inevitable to an audience. Usually, when a theme sounds odd or clipped or artificial or contrived, it is because a step in logic has been either missed completely or overridden in favor of emotional decision-making, or leading with our hearts before our minds. Music, especially classical music which hits our emotions first, is more often than not constructed from an intellectual viewpoint first, and because of that, as performers, we have to construct our interpretations with the same priorities. Well, that's it for today. Keep practicing, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.